Hello everyone, my name is Andy and I'm really excited today to take you into this webinar called 5 Unconscious Biases in Depth and importantly, how they impact recruitment. I think it's a really foundational webinar where you can learn a lot about unconscious biases and how they affect our decision making, which lays a great foundation before you then can go into more of our resources online that talk about debiased and inclusive recruitment in general. In terms of what I'm going to take you through, it's really going to be a deep dive into these 5 biases. I'll start talking a little bit about the applied community and what we do and which resources we offer up for free so that people can recruit in a fairer and more inclusive way. But these are the 5 biases I'm going to take you through: Nobel Prize winner, confirmation bias, rank order effect, stereotyping, and representative heuristics, followed by a little bit of the philosophy that we recommend for how to reduce bias by design in your recruitment process. So just to summarize what we would like people to learn from this webinar, the first one is to become a bit more familiar with these 5 common biases. Perhaps go and have a look at some of the studies for yourself to decide for yourself. And then understand what are the consequences of this type of bias. What does it mean in terms of our day-to-day decision making, but specifically what does it mean in terms of talent acquisition and hiring? And thirdly, how can you mitigate bias in hiring? What are the methods you can use? Again, it'll just be a taster because there are some more detailed webinars later on, but this webinar definitely a great place to start. So a little bit on Applied. We are the ethical and predictive recruitment platform. We provide hiring software that improves the diversity of the talent pool and predicts the best candidates who apply for the job. You can look out there at lots of other HR tech software, and the vast majority of it is focused on the efficiency and streamlining of your process, which is important to save time and money when you're recruiting people. But what we try and do is really focus on getting you really high quality of hire and also leveling the playing field to make it as inclusive process as possible. And in order to get the business benefits of building diverse, high-performing teams. So how do we do it? We sit on a wealth of research that comes from our background. We are a spin-out of the Behavioral Insights team, also known as the Nudge Unit, which is a group associated with the UK government that uses behavioral science nudges for improving public policy to improve social good. And governments all around the world, as a result of this group, now have their own groups in order to use this very powerful behavioral science in getting people to make decisions in the right way or the best outcomes from those decisions. We also built this platform and got a lot of research from Professor Iris Burnett at Harvard. And she has this book here called What Works? Gender Equality by Design. And what we've done is baked in that research, that philosophy into a platform where we've redesigned the way people hire in order for you to see the best of candidates and see all different types of candidates from different backgrounds. Here are a few of our taglines, some of the things we believe in. We believe in understanding the research, the peer-reviewed research, which talks about the best methods to hire or the pitfalls to avoid in hiring, rather than just going to the same tried and tested sifting process or recruitment process that uses just CVs or resumes. Secondly, we look at skills over credentials. So one of the big philosophical differences about Applied is that we're testing on someone's ability to do the job by testing their skills, rather than just looking for something historical or which school they went to, whether they've done the job before or had a similar job title, or even came from a competitor whose brand name you know. Thirdly, science over the status quo. this idea that we can use science to recruit better, and that we shouldn't just rely on doing the same thing over and over again because it's familiar. We should try new things and continuously improve. And so this webinar that you're watching now is part of our community where we try to give away our knowledge for free so that the world can learn to hire and recruit better. So the way we do that is we share tools. We have sort of online inclusive job description tools. We have a job board. We do job board analytics. We do webinars such as these. We also organize panel talks. We have training days, and then a wealth of other resources like blog posts, worksheets, workshops, templates, you name it. Go on our website and you can probably find something for it. And the whole idea of this is to really empower organizations to debias hiring and to hire better. So we want to make a space where people can courageously, intentionally, and meaningfully alter hiring for an inclusive future. Quite often, the changes required to build this best-in-class recruitment process are quite large, and so it can take a lot of courage to change an organization in this way. And that's what we're intending to do, to arm people with the support and the knowledge they need so they can have a big impact. Here are some of our customers. There are lots of different industries and sectors, large companies, small companies, all represented here. It really is a universal need that we are solving for. And once people move away from a traditional recruitment process to something more like the applied method, it's pretty rare that they will ever go back to the status quo way of hiring. Okay, so that's a little bit about us, but I want to stress that everything, or the methods that we talk about in our webinars, we try and give you a practical way of doing it on your own, as many of these things are kind of very actionable and easy to do in your process. But now I'm going to jump into bias number one, straight in there, and talk about this thing called the Nobel Prize winner effect. It has a few different names, but this is my favorite name because it gives an idea of what we're talking about. And this is centered around the question of how does candidate order impact assessment? And here I'm talking about candidate order relative to one another, to each candidate. And this idea is really interesting because if you imagine a stack of 10 CVs and one of them is a Nobel laureate, so they've won a Nobel Prize, and in it you have the unlucky honor of also being in that stack. Where would you like to come in that stack next to the Nobel laureate? And it's an interesting question, and probably many things pop into your head, because obviously it's a hard act to follow, perhaps, if they are incredibly highly qualified, but just how pervasive is this impact on other candidates? So using our own data, this is what we see. So we had, it's outlined in this blog here, but taking a large sample of real job applications, we looked at what the average score was out of 5, and the average score for this sample data was 3.14. And then what we did was we looked at the average score of the people that followed a bottom candidate. And by a bottom candidate, I mean someone who scored below average, maybe in the 2s or 1s, and could see a noticeable bump up of their score when just from following this type of candidate. And the other effect here is if you follow the top candidate. In this case, this is the Nobel laureate. So if you follow them versus the average, you are more likely to receive a bump down. And so this is the idea that it matters who you follow. If you follow a great candidate, you're more likely to be marked down a bit. If you follow a not so great candidate, you're more likely to be marked up. And this is a very real effect. And what we found in our data is that after a good candidate, the next candidate will be marked down by 4%. Likewise, after a below average candidate, the next candidate is marked up by 2%. So So there definitely is an effect here. And what you might think is, oh, that's fairly small. It's probably not going to impact the outcome of any recruitment process. Whereas I want to sort of just make the point here, or 2 points, in fact, that these may seem small on their own, but firstly, there are lots and lots of these effects going on in a recruitment process, and they all add up. And secondly, even a small change in your score can impact whether or not you're called for an interview. So this integrates that. This illustrates that second point. And what this graph shows is, imagine all these people applied for a job, 80 people, and each score was stack ranked from the best to the lowest score based on their average. And what usually happens in something like this is 10 people, maybe 15 people, if it's a large grad round, for example, will be called for interview. And what you tend to find is that the highest scorers tend to be bunched up together. And what that means is just a small percentage change means that you're not getting an interview. So if you are in fact impacted by the biases that I just mentioned before, your chances of interview are not really just affected by 4% or 2%, but they're affected by a large enough level that you can get bumped out of the top 10, top 15, or in a smaller recruiting rounds, top 5. So really some food for thought as to what the significance of these biases are. So that is the first one. Before I go on to the remaining 4, I'm just going to talk a little bit about unconscious bias and why it happens. And a great place to start is this idea of System 1 and System 2 thinking, popularized by Daniel Kahneman in his Thinking Fast and Slow book. System 1 thinking is around the way that we think in a fast, intuitive, and emotional way. The idea is that every day we are bombarded by so much information, so many potential decisions, that if we took it all in and agonized over every detail, you would quickly use up all your energy and just fall into a heap on the floor. So we need these 2 systems in order to process the day-to-day. And System 1 is around intuitive decisions, fight or flight sometimes as well. But a great example is if you're commuting home from work or to work via car or on the train or public transport. And when you arrive at work, if you think back to that commute, most of the time it's a bit hazy. You can't really remember what the decisions you made. And that's because most of the time you are on autopilot. So even if you're driving, which might be perceived as something where you need to be concentrating a lot, you are concentrating, but on a sort of different level. Most of the decisions and the route you're taking are being done by a System 1 type thinking. System 2 is a lot more about slow, conscious, and effortful thinking. So in new situations, in important decisions or infrequent decisions. So an example here is if you're in a new city on holiday, for example, you might be looking at a map and thinking really deeply about where do I go, left here, right here, I'm trying to get over here. A lot different if you were in your own city or place that you lived. So it's important to understand that biases do creep in both of these systems, but it tends to be in System 1 thinking where the biases I'm going to take you through today seem to have their biggest hold. And it's important to note that recruitment, when you're assessing and judging other human beings to see if they're suitable to work in this role, is a really important and very complex decision with lots of variables. Therefore, we should all be in System 2 thinking mode. And what can happen all too often is that we fall into System 1 mode and fall prey to the biases that I'm taking through today. So why does bias occur? Here are 4 reasons. So this idea that we need to act fast. Therefore, we don't have time to go through all the information. In fact, we can take shortcuts because we need to get it done. Those sorts of things can bring out biases. The next one is simplifying what to remember. So maybe you have a long interview you can't remember every single word of what the interviewee says. And so what do? We tend to remember the most interesting or the emotional highs of that interview, as well as the end of that interview, and bits in between we won't remember at all. The next one is too much information. So if someone has a really long CV or extensive cover letter, you're going to pick and choose the bits of information that you're going to remember because it's just too much to process. And the last one of the other reasons is navigating ambiguity. So if we're missing information or something is not clear, our brains will try to be helpful, and they will fill in those blanks with things like stereotypes or assumptions, which can lead us down the wrong path. So the summary is our brains are trying to be helpful and help us to process the amount of data. And in the action of being helpful, they can actually add noise to decision making and be unhelpful. There are so many of these biases. This is a great graphic which illustrates a lot of them, if not all of them. Split into the areas that I just took you through. So too much information, not enough meaning, need to act fast, and what should we remember? And today I'm just taking you through 5, but there's many, many more that pop up in recruitment. Through our other webinars, we talk about other biases and how, and importantly, how to curtail them in your process. So that is what bias is, unconscious bias, and why it exists and how it can impact our decision making. I want to, before we jump back to the other 4 unconscious biases in depth, I'm going to talk a little bit about bias in hiring and how bias can impact hiring. And to do this, I'm going to use this study from 2016 in Germany. And what researchers did was they sent out almost 1,000 resumes and applications with this name, Sandra Bauer, and this photo of them. So in Germany and many parts of Europe, it's common still for you to put a photo on your applications. But let's face it, for countries that don't allow that, like the UK or the US or Australia, with LinkedIn, essentially at every stage, people are going to be looking at your photo anyway. So Sandra Bauer sent out almost 1,000 applications and got a callback rate of 19%, which I think is pretty good. And then what they did was they changed the name, changed the name from Sandra Bauer to Miriam, and her callback rate received 14%. So already a dip of 5 percentage points. And then what they did was they changed the photo to one of Miriam wearing a headscarf, and what they saw is a huge drop off from 14% to 4%. And this is the only details that they changed. And when I first saw this, it's shocking, right? And I thought, what's going on here, and how isolated is this review, this research? So what is going on here? There's many things, but one of the main things going on is this idea of bias, and a part of that being unconscious bias that affects us all in the way that we perceive data, process data, and assess people applying for jobs. So in answer to the question, is this an isolated study? The answer is absolutely not. This is a meta study down the bottom, which shows from 2009 to 2016 alone, there was more than 90 of these studies done across 26 countries. And in sort of about 85% of these studies, it showed a significant negative impact on the minority group. So as we just saw, we have Sandra and Miriam in Germany, and then we have Pascal and Rashid, 14% versus 7% in France, and then Andrew and Mohammed, 11% to 6% in the UK. So the research and data is very clear. There is something going on, something wrong with the way that we recruit, and it impacts the minority group a lot more than the majority group, and causes not only people to miss out on jobs, but also hiring companies to hire people who may not be the absolute best for the job based on these unconscious biases. Okay, so that was a little bit about how if you just use a status quo hiring method and don't really consider how bias is impacting your decisions, it can cause you to get the outcomes to deteriorate. And now I'm going to jump back into these biases in depth. And the second one I'm going to talk about is confirmation bias. And you've probably heard of this before, but here's a really great illustration of it. I want to ask you to ask yourself, who would you rather hire, Sarah or Isabel? Just read them quickly yourself and then decide. And then I'll just read through it and talk you through it. So Sarah, who is intelligent, industrious, impulsive, stubborn, envious. Isabel, who is envious, stubborn, impulsive, industrious, and intelligent. And you might have gotten it since I read them out because it's a little bit more obvious. But what happens here is our brains cling on to the first adjective, and then it appears that the adjectives seem to have less weight as we go down the list, when in fact they are the exact same descriptors, just reversed. So Sarah's and Isabel's, if you look at the words, they are the exact same words, but just in different orders. This is the idea that the first adjective then affects how we review subsequent ones. So if she's intelligent but impulsive, you might think, oh, okay, maybe that's good. Maybe that means proactive. If she's intelligent and stubborn, you might think, oh, great, she'll stand up for what she believes in, and those sorts of things. Whereas if she's envious and stubborn, you start to the adjective stubborn takes on a different meaning, and that's the way our brains tend to work here. So confirmation bias is the tendency to look for, perceive, and remember information that confirms your existing beliefs. This is a great comic, and I think maybe many of us can see ourselves in it. So the idea that maybe we have a conversation with a friend where you disagree, and you go, right, I'm going to go find the truth, or I'm going to go find data out there to support what I say. And we all think we have the best of intentions. We go online and we find the first thing that agrees with what you're saying, and then we go, yeah, here it is, gotcha. Whereas I think actually what's going on there is confirmation bias. So what happens with confirmation bias? It's not just finding the data or information that proves your point. That is one of the elements. It's actually deeper and I guess more pervasive than just that. So we have this selective fact-seeking where we ignore data that doesn't confirm our beliefs. The next one is selective interpretation, where even if we do find data that is counter to what we believe, we're more likely to either say, oh, that's not quite the right interpretation, or to sort of discredit the data or study in some way in our minds. The next one is really interesting, where we can exhibit selective memory, where we may read an article or some research which does actually give data or evidence counter to what we believe in. But what we will do is at a later date remember that it actually supported us, which is probably, a fairly scary idea, that we are susceptible to things like this. And lastly, ignoring challenges. So maybe the data that we found that supported us was a bit shaky, wasn't that credible. We would ignore that just because it supported what we believed in to start with. So this is something that can crop up in recruitment, and there are ways to reduce this type of bias. So reduce strongly held beliefs that can cloud our judgment. The first one is to create objective metrics for scoring. The idea being, if you have a marking rubric, it can draw you back to the things you're actually looking for, so that you're not influenced by your initial belief and you're forced to be objective about how you assess this candidate on that one skill or variable that you're looking at. The next one is around using situational questions or work samples. So here, a candidate, it's much better to test a candidate on actually doing the job if you can, rather than just seeing maybe what their education level is, whether they've done the job before, because those things are just proxies for being able to do the job. So if you're able to use situational questions, you're less reliant on confirmation bias that comes from, oh, they went to a good university, therefore they will be good, those sorts of things. The third point is using the data that you collect during the process to make your decisions. So rather than sitting in an interview and saying, do I want to hire this person? You actually use the interview to gather data on the skills and abilities of that person. And then once you gather all the data, get it together at the end of the process, and then use that data to make a decision. So you're less likely to rely on your gut in the moment. You're more likely to use these more objective ways of scoring. Bias number 3. So this is the rank order effect. So I want everyone to think about this question. Imagine that you could pick the time for your interview. What time would you pick? 8, 11, 3, or 5? Now, I can maybe imagine what is going through your head. It's probably the same thing that we're all thinking. We're all thinking about how well we will perform, and also how tired or grumpy the interviewers may be. So those of us that are morning people might pick 8 a.m. because we work well in the morning, and know that perhaps the interviewers will be fresh at 8 a.m. Those of us who are not morning people would probably hate to have 8 a.m. and in fact worry that if you got an interviewer who was not a morning person at 8 a.m., you might be in trouble at that time slot. But the other time slots are maybe equally unappealing. So at 11 a.m., you probably think, close to lunch, they might be hungry, start to get a bit cranky. 3 p.m., we've all been in a mid-afternoon lull sometimes if we have a large lunch, for example. And 5 p.m., just before people go back home, maybe the last interview of the day after they've been through a whole heap and are very tired, maybe lost their patience and don't want to do anymore. So a really tough set of times to pick. But the point I wanted to illustrate is that we all naturally think about these things in terms of times of day. Hungry, how am I going to perform? How are the interview panel going to be? And there's so much complexity that goes into this thinking, and for good reason. And here's a chart from 2011, which illustrates this point. So you have time on the x-axis. This is one day, starting at the morning through to the end of the day. And on the y-axis, this was a study of judges and the parole decisions they made to people going for parole. And this is the proportion of favorable decisions. So the higher up on the y-axis, the more likely the decision was to be favorable to that person going through the parole appeal. And what you find is it starts off fairly high, but then drops down to this time, and then springs back up, likewise goes down, and a couple of times in the day. So my question is, what is happening at these times? And you'll probably get it straight away. These are meal times or breaks. And someone actually described this as perhaps the blood sugar of the judges going off a cliff. So if you are going for your hearing just before lunch, according to this research, according to this data, you are more likely to receive an unfavorable decision or a less favorable decision in that case. And look at towards the end of the day, you get this final spike after this break or meal, and it almost immediately drops off to very low as they're tired from the entire day. And And I was amazed the first time that I saw this study, simply because judges, as you know, in our society, are highly trained decision makers that are supposed to be take decisions or judgments objectively. And if even they show such a big impact of purely just the time of day or how hungry they are throughout the day, then it's what chance do we have as talent acquisition professionals or people reviewing people's CVs or sitting in interviews. It's a really, really fascinating study. I recommend you go and look it up. The link is down below. So what does this mean? It really does affect recruitment in a big way. We're all prone to cognitive overload, which means sort of too much for our brains to process. When we get tired and hungry, our brain is not as good at processing cognitive load. And what that can mean is if we're overwhelmed, we can default to the safe option. So what that means in recruitment is you'll pick someone from a well-known university over one from a less well-known one or no degree, or you'll pick someone from a brand name company that you know of rather than a less known, a well-known one, or you'll pick someone who's similar to you or similar to the majority of people in that organization. And what that happens is you tend to create these homogeneous results where everyone is from the same background and they tend to look, sound, and act the same. Just to carry on from that, this is a really interesting longitudinal study from 1957 to 2011, where they looked at people's surnames and how they fared in their careers. And what they did was they grouped people with, they used controls to try and control for these variables like similar IQ, performance in school, and even attractiveness. And what they found in that study is that the higher up you are in the alphabet in terms of your surname, the better future career performance you had. So a really fascinating outcome here. One of the reasons they hypothesize is that if you are at the start of the alphabet, you are more likely to be called on during school or during any process where things are put in alphabetical order. Whereas if you're towards the end of that process, it's more likely that, maybe they run out of time before they get to you, or maybe they'll, you're on day 2 or day 3, or they'll never get to you. And so you're not always going to be called on to do those activities. So really fascinating study there. So what impact does it have on recruitment? We see about a 5% boost on average using our own data. So the average score of candidates have applied with the study 3.35, and then purely by coming first, being the first in the pile to be reviewed, it's bumped up to 3.52, which is about 5% increase. Again, I want to take you back to the so what. So it's a little bit of a bump. It's not actually going to have that big an impact on where you land. Again, it's not true. 2 reasons. The first reason is there's lots of these effects going on, and they build up or they amplify one another. And secondly, even a small change can take you from being, say here, 1st to 12th is perhaps maybe about a 5%, 10% change, and then 12th to 29th, definitely not getting an interview, again, is probably about a 5 to 10% change. So these things matter, and it's very easy to dismiss them and say, oh, well, that's just the way we all make decisions. But when you are actually able to control for them, you are just able to make much better and fairer decisions. So how do you control for this rank order bias? Here are a few ways. So one of them is you randomize the order in which they appear to reviewers. This doesn't remove the bias. It just means that it's no longer the people whose surnames start with a Z that this affects the most. So jumble up those CVs so that it's not always the person starting with A first. And that sort of just randomizes the effect of this over the candidates. The next thing is to understand and consider your brain and cognitive overload, and to take breaks, food breaks, be aware of when you're tired or grumpy or cranky, and set interview slots accordingly, as well as reducing your cognitive overload. So don't do 10 back-to-back interviews. I reckon probably by number 3 or 4, you will have already lost your patience with them. So do spread them out. Make sure you have gaps between them. It's good for you, but it's also good for your candidates who get the best shot at being assessed and reviewed objectively. Okay, that's 3 out of 5 biases. We're on to number 4 now. I'm going to take you through stereotyping. And it was one of the early studies that solidified, I guess, the thinking around stereotyping is this one from 1933, Katz and Braley, where they identified this thing they called group fallacy attitude, where it's this mistaken belief on behalf of participants, which are common attributes associated with different nationalities, ethnicities, or religious groups. And I guess stereotypes aren't really necessarily something that we all talk about or define with each other. They are concepts which we are socialized into from a young age. This study here from Fisk et al. Asked a whole bunch of students to talk about different groups of people, different stereotype groups, and to place them on this matrix where you have the warmth of a group, high or low. So how likely are they to be, friendly or helpful, or vice versa? And then competence, how likely are they to be able to get things done, get things sorted, high or low? And what's interesting is the groups that were high in warmth and high in competence tended to be the in-group groups, and they're the groups that the participants were members of or very close to, which is something that we all do. Whereas other groups that we didn't know that well or had to rely on stereotypes for ranked in different places. And here is one of the charts from that study. As you can see, it plots low competence to high competence, low warmth to high warmth. And if you look at high warmth and high competence, you'll have middle class, white people, students. This was in line with the people who I think were the sample sets or the participants in the study. Whereas low warmth, low competence, welfare recipients, for example, and then high competence, sort of lowish warmth is sort of, for example, rich people, and other groups dotted around the place. I think one of the key takeaways of the study was just how consistent these stereotypes were, despite the fact that they're not really explicitly defined anywhere. They are just around us in our day-to-day lives and as we're socialized and growing up. So what does that mean in recruitment? It essentially means that if we come across infer that someone is of a group that we don't know much about, we are more likely to unconsciously use a stereotype to fill in their attributes, fill in that missing information. And as we know, stereotypes are often always grossly inaccurate. And so in terms of recruitment, we are misled by any stereotypes that we use to assess someone. But you can reduce the impact of stereotypes. So the first well-known method is to anonymize CVs. This is where you remove someone's name from their application, and it means you never see it. So it means you're never impacted by those stereotype biases. And it's important to remember that you remove the negative impacts of stereotypes of minority groups, but you're also removing the potentially positive impacts of in-group stereotype groups, people that are like you, like the person doing the reviewing or assessing, don't benefit from any bump because you can't see their name. The next thing is to use structured decisions, a grading system, so that you're not relying on gut. You're not talking about your gut feel of someone. You're instead using very clear decision points. Again, we have using work samples, and this is a recurring theme that applied always goes back to. If you're able to test them on the ability to do the job and test their skills directly, you're able to cut out a whole bunch of biases associated with where they worked before, what school do they go to, those sorts of things. And then always use a standard rubric for grading applicants. So again, we're trying to move away from gut feel to an objective measuring system. And so rather than saying, "Ooh, I don't know if I, felt that person was that warm," or something like that, you can then bring it back to the rubric, because the rubric will tell you, firstly, what is important for the job and not, and if it's important, how to grade it from 1 to 5, for example. The last thing is to make your recruitment process measurable and accountable. So you gather data from the above on how people are interviewing others, and you make interviews a lot more data-driven, so that it's no longer acceptable to say, "I just didn't really like him or her. I didn't think they would fit in with the team," for example. Instead, you've got a rubric with data that says, "Okay, I marked them down because they didn't seem to have the skills in this area." That last one allows you to sort of capture patterns and to retrain interviewers who perhaps don't have that view and are still relying on gut in interviews. Okay, last bias, before I go into a little bit more into how we recommend that you combat these things. And this one is called the Representativeness Heuristic. And what is it? It is making judgments based on the similarity of an object or person to an existing group or persona. So it's essentially using proxies. And this is based on our inability to process heaps of data all the time. So it's a heuristic, which is a mental shortcut, which essentially means if something looks like something else that we know, then we're more likely to attribute those characteristics to that person. An example given by Daniel Kahneman is this idea that, say I was invited to go to a concert with a friend, and they were going to bring 2 other friends. Those 2 other friends were described as, one of them is a musician in the band, and one of them is a scientist that works in the lab. And then I get there and I meet them for the first time, and one of them has glasses on and looks fairly reserved. The other one, looks like a rock star. And I assume that the scientist is the one with the glasses. So the rock star looking one is the rock star, where in actuality they are the reverse. So this idea that it's actually, I made that assumption based on a lack of information and not being able to process all of the data at the time, but actually it leads me to a wrong conclusion. Another way of saying this is using proxies. So are you using something else to determine if they have a skill, rather than actually testing them on that skill? So here's a great example. You always get these types of stories in mainstream media. This one was the coffee cup test, where this CEO or boss said the surefire way to tell if someone was a great recruit or not is whether at the interview, after having a cup of coffee, they took the cup back to the kitchen or offered to. Which, I mean, on the face of it, I agreed. I think most of us would take back the coffee cup or want to. We wouldn't just leave it there and expect someone to clean it up. But the point is that getting that thing wrong doesn't mean that person is a bad person. Interviews are such artificial, strange, stressful experiences that many of us go through not fairly infrequently. that when you're under that artificial stress, you do all sorts of strange things. You might forget the coffee cup, you might be distracted, you might be thinking about the other million other things that you're worrying about in an interview. And so falling prey to this really doesn't tell us whether this person is, got the right values or whether they can do the job. It is just a red herring. So please do be wary of any tells or any myths or any shortcuts like these that you might read interviews about. So examples of representativeness heuristic in recruitment are everywhere. It's a fairly foundational bias or heuristic that leads to lots of other effects. But any job, if you've ever seen a entry-level job that requires 2 years of experience, or a job that you must have a degree for, even though it doesn't seem like you probably need a degree. People that hire from specific universities, usually not overtly, of course, or even things like number of years of work experience or having to have specific role titles. What people are doing is they think that the group of people that have certain degrees are of a certain intelligence, and they're looking for intelligent people, and therefore you're associating those two groups. So how do you reduce the impact? Again, so you'll start to notice some common themes with the methods that we recommend. The first one is testing skills directly. So don't use proxies. In fact, it's much better to relax those proxies and say, you don't need to have a degree, for example, and to test those skills directly. So use things called work samples, use intro exercises, use interviews that use situational judgment type questions. Again, there are more resources online that'll take you through those types of assessments and how you use them and how to build them and when and why you should use them. The next one is to create a list of core competencies. So this is so simple but so key, is to actually create a list of the things that you're looking for in the role. And it doesn't have to be just like the ability to do the job. It can be sort of very technical skills like forensic accounting or financial model building. It can also be things like teamwork, stakeholder management, or it can be values like integrity, those sorts of things. And finally, again, another great thing to do is to create a rubric to score all candidates. So you're not giving them 10 out of 10 because they went to the right university. Instead, you're giving them 10 because they answered this job-specific question incredibly well and show that they have the potential to do the job. Great. So those are those biases, 5 of them. There's, each of them had a link to the research at the bottom, so please do read up on them even more. I think as I said, this webinar is a great foundation to our other resources. And I'm going to talk a little bit now about the philosophy that Applied recommends on how we can further remove these biases from recruitment. So the first one is becoming aware of them. This unfortunately tends to be the first and last port of call to organizations looking to hire more inclusively. So it's essential to understand biases. So things like unconscious bias training are useful, and it educates people as to what they are and why they appear and sort of how they work. But the key thing about that type of education is that the research shows that it doesn't actually change people's behavior. We have a whole webinar that takes a deep dive into the research on unconscious bias training, for example. And the research shows that at best, they're good for awareness. At worst, they can be counterproductive. But either way, they don't really change people's behaviors. And so we adopt the philosophy of designing systems to decrease the bias, because willpower alone and best good intentions are not enough to hold back these biases. And so what applied recommends is you design a system or a process where the bias cannot creep in. And examples of those are things like anonymizing CVs and resumes and using skills-based assessments and work samples. So how do we do it? At Applied, if you look at a traditional process, there are so many biases that creep in, and each of these biases tends to degrade the quality of the decision-making that occurs at each stage. So that here are a bunch. We saw the graphic earlier. I think there's over 300 of them. We talked about just 5 today. But what do we do? So what you do, again, is to design a process where you are preventing bias from creeping in the first place. So if you're looking at a CV or resume, there's so many opportunities for bias to creep in. And so what we do is we might anonymize those resumes, and then that stops things like affinity bias and stereotype bias. If you then move away from education as an indicator, or move away from brand names, or has this person worked in this exact job for 5 years previously, and test on skills and using work samples, you are even better able to control or remove these other biases. So I've talked a lot about nudges, and a nudge is this theory used by behavioral scientists to essentially cheaply alter people's behavior. And I mean cheaply because they're usually by ordering things in a particular way. They're usually by removing people's names. They're usually by just small changes to text or the way things are positioned, rather than something really expensive. They're just little changes in the way that data is presented, so it is interpreted without or with as low bias as possible. And that is one of the philosophical points of the Applied platform. So some key takeaways are from this webinar, apart from the 5 biases, are that there were common themes in the way that you mitigate against these biases. So the first one is structuring to reduce the opportunities for bias. The second one is mimicking the job and testing people on the actual skills to do the job. And the third one is score and track everything, so that you can make sure it's as objective as possible, and measure so that you can improve over time. Just a little teaser on skills-based hiring, which we have other webinars on. But skills-based hiring is a style of hiring where you test for the skills of someone rather than if they have done it before. It seems obvious when you say it like that, but 95% of jobs out there will ask people to have done the job before and then hire them based on that. Or at least they won't be brought to interview until they can prove that they've done this job before. So the way that you build skills-based questions or work samples is you start with what skill, attitude, behavior, capability you're looking for. Then you think about what that person would do on the job in a day-to-day basis, and then think about what type of challenges they would actually meet. And once you're able to assess on skills, you're able to actually put a score to different things you're looking for, and you can see a map of how well a person versus the peer group performs against these different skills. Because everyone is different, there may be trade-offs, pros and cons of different candidates, and this helps you to make a data-driven decision as to who to bring on. Quick example of a work sample, and again, we've got resources, webinars on our website that will go into these. But imagine this is a program director. The types of tasks on the left-hand side they have to do, and on the right-hand side, these are the skills that are being tested. And it's talking about how the funding for a summer program has fallen through. What do you cut and why is the main thing? Why do you prioritize these cuts? And the idea of this is It is something that could actually happen on the role. It is not tell me a time when, it's here is the problem, please work through it. And it importantly tests the things that you actually care about. And they're always backed up by a review guide. So marking out of 5 in this case, what does a 1-star look like? What does a 3-star look like? What does a 5-star look like? It's given to every reviewer so that you can make it as objective as possible, to bring everyone back to the same criteria rather than leaving them to make up that criteria in their head or be ruled by gut decisions. Very briefly, just a little summary of if you get this right, what happens. So the applied platform, we see a 4 times increase in ethnic diversity of candidates, up to 4 times. So you really do see the candidate pool change and become more diverse as you use the methods in the applied platform. Using traditional hiring versus applied would mean you miss out of 60% of the applied hires. So you genuinely see people who you wouldn't normally find based on a traditional CV sift method. And the third one is that candidates truly love this way of recruiting because it's fair, inclusive, open, transparent, and it reflects our organization's values and how they like to treat people. So it means you get a great candidate experience. Okay, that's it. Thank you so much for watching this webinar. Please, please, please go to our website and watch more. If you want to hear about how to build work samples, if you want to hear about how to do better interviews, if you want to learn more about inclusive sourcing as well. Thank you so much, and I'll leave you there. Have a great day.